Now, when I was planning out these Batman videos, I wanted to cap off this month of videos with the most recent Batman movie, that being Robert Pattinson's The Batman. But I've talked so much about the Adam West Batman show and talking about these movies that I feel like I should really give it its own video. And what better way to wrap up Bat Month than talk about the first Batman movie ever theatrically released? Batman the movie. That's right. Before we had Batman, there was Batman the movie, because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't Batman the TV series, it was Batman the movie, because this movie came out in 1966 right alongside the Batman TV series. And kind of like how Mask of the Phantasm was a spin-off, but it was still definitely connected with the Batman animated series, this is the same thing but for the 60s Batman show. It definitely feels like it's still in the same world, it still has all the same people involved, same actors, same producers, same costumes, everything is still the same, but now we have a story that's feature length. And this movie is campy and silly, and it makes no apologies about it. In fact, that was one of the best things about Adam West's take on the Dark Knight, is he wasn't the Dark Knight, he was the Bright Knight. He was a Batman that was a role model for kids, he was optimistic, he was a public servant, he was a duly sworn officer of the law, and it was silly and goofy and over the top, and that's the point. Because what they did in this series, and particularly in this movie, they took all the weird and zany stuff that was happening in the comics at the time, especially in the 50s, after the Comics Code Authority kind of took the teeth out of a lot of Batman's more famous rogues gallery. Started getting some really silly comics in the 50s and 60s, and it was very watered down, very kid friendly. Batman wasn't allowed to kill anybody, the villains weren't really allowed to kill anybody either. The Joker stopped being this mass murdering clown and started being this trickster, this jokester that had a bunch of gags. And what producer William Dozer did is he took all these weird and campy elements from the comics. I was like, hey, this would make a really entertaining kids show. Parents could laugh at it and the kids would be enthralled by it. When you watch this movie as a kid, you are enthralled by Batman fighting the different villains, using his different gadgets, climbing up walls, doing all the zany over the top things. And as an adult, you look at it and you just kind of laugh along with it because it knows it's over the top. That's the beauty of it. They're fully aware of how ridiculous this is. And Adam West, to his credit, never cracks. He's playing it 100% straight, like he's on Shakespeare's stage or something like that. He is 100% bought into this character and is just inhabiting this crazy world where you can just dress up like a bat and fight crime and have this bat cave and a Batmobile and a Batcopter and a Batboat. And because he's so committed to the bit, and because everybody else is equally committed to the bit, it is always entertaining. You have all these different villains, unlike the TV series where you only had one villain for each episode, or maybe later on they do two villains teaming up and you get some fun antics there. Here we have four villains, and they're A-list villains. It's the Joker, the Penguin, the Riddler, and the Catwoman. That's right, they call her the Catwoman in here, and she's played by Lee Merriweather. And she's the one case where they did recast an actress from the classic TV show. She did not play Catwoman in the TV show. There was actually a couple different actresses that played her on the show, Julie Newmar and Eartha Kitt, both fantastic. Although Lee Merriweather does a decent job as Catwoman in here, kind of in the same vein as Julie Newmar, where she's the femme fatale. But unlike Julie Newmar, her cat-like appearance isn't just due to her costume. She just kind of acts cat-like in her mannerisms and her facial expressions when she's trying to be fierce, or even when she's trying to be seductive or sneaky. She just has these little twitches, these little facial expressions that honestly go a long way for making her a memorable Catwoman. Especially when she has to share her time with three other fantastic actors that bring such life into their character portrayals, who honestly, with the exception of Cesar Romero, whose portrayal of the Joker doesn't resonate with me, mainly because we've had so many great Joker adaptations over the years that make Cesar Romero's take on the Joker feel more of a product of its time than a memorable Joker portrayal. The Penguin and Riddler in this movie, played by Burgess Meredith and Frank Gorshin respectively, are fantastic, standout actors, standout portrayals of their respective characters, because the Penguin and Riddler have popped up here and there in different movies. In fact, we just got Penguin and Riddler in The Batman, which is kind of funny. But until that movie, we really haven't had a good comic book accurate adaptation of the Penguin, or at least one that I've been satisfied by, except for Burgess Meredith, because Burgess Meredith actually plays the Penguin like he was in the comics. He does a great job here too as kind of the de facto leader of this group. He's by far the most organized of all of these villains, and yeah, he's a little insane, but he's by no means the same level of insane as everybody else on this submarine that they've bought from the military. And did I mention that this movie is completely ridiculous? Because when they're not in their not so secret lair on top of a bar, they're just cruising around in the submarine that looks like a penguin that they just bought from the government way too easily. And last but not least, Frank Gorshin as the Riddler is an iconic depiction of an iconic character. He brings to life that original design of the Riddler from the comics, where he's just this manic, over-the-top goofball with riddles thrown everywhere. And that's all brought out through his physicality and that giggle that he lets out. That is so Frank Gorshin, and for me, I always associate the Riddler first with that portrayal. And like I said in my Batman Forever review, it's why I don't hate the Jim Carrey interpretation as much as I feel like a lot of people do, because it's just harkening back to Frank Gorshin, and he is my favorite. He's great here. He's just a big ball of energy, but he's still smart. He's still kind of calculating in his more quiet moments. There's moments in this movie where you see him just sitting around thinking, coming up with plans, and then presenting them. And when he gets all excited, that's when that kind of crazy manic Riddler comes out. And all of these villains balance each other out in a very believable way. And I was worried looking back on here that it would feel so overstuffed, like the Joel Schumacher movies tended to be when they tried to combine villains and subplots. But here, everybody is painted with such broad strokes, and they have that wealth of TV series experience to fall back on to keep their characters feeling consistent from scene to scene, where it doesn't really feel overstuffed. Sure, the characters aren't fleshed out nearly as well as they would have been if they were given their own episode on a TV show or their own movie. In this over-the-top comic booky world, I don't really mind, because they're just so much fun to watch. The characters are consistent with not just how they were depicted in the comics of the day, but with what you'd expect from watching the Batman show. But there is one thing about this movie that always kind of dragged it down, and it happens around halfway, and it really brings the pacing and enjoyment of this movie to a screeching halt, and that is the little romance that Bruce Wayne has with Miss Kitka, who's Catwoman in disguise. And she's supposed to be this Russian journalist that got a threatening letter from the Riddler under her door, and Bruce Wayne's there to protect her, and it turns into a romance. But it's really just a big ploy to kidnap Bruce Wayne so that Batman will try to rescue him, and then they can kill Batman. That's the whole plan of this middle section of the movie, and it's by far the weakest, because for one, there's not a lot of action going on, and even when Bruce Wayne does get captured and he has to make his escape, it's a little fun, but I'm not gonna lie if it wasn't a little underwhelming. I was really hoping that Robin would come in to try to break him out, and they would have to devise some convoluted scheme to hide his secret identity while still escaping and making it look like Batman and Robin were there to save them. I feel like there's a lot more they could have done with that setup that they didn't really do, because it's just Bruce Wayne escapes, beats them all up, and runs back to Wayne Manor, and nobody really questions how a billionaire philanthropist playboy can just beat the snot out of all these pirates and supervillains and walk away without a scratch on them. And I know a romance subplot between Batman and Catwoman is kind of a staple in Bat media. Whenever Catwoman's involved, there's always some kind of romantic entanglement or romantic subplot, and most of the time it works because Catwoman's an interesting character, and her relationship with Batman is much more complicated than just your standard hero-villain relationship. There's some sexual tension there, there's some intrigue, Batman thinks he might be able to turn Catwoman, and all that really came about in the 60s Batman show. Sure, there was hints of that earlier on in the comics, and I'm sure they had their fair share of romances there. But for most audiences, they were exposed to that for the first time with Julie Newmar's Catwoman, and you see Batman struggling with the morality of, oh, well, maybe she can be saved, but she's so set in her ways. What's the right thing to do there? And by creating this Miss Kitka alias, it kind of robs the movie of that classic Batman Catwoman tension, because Batman's infatuated with Kitka, not Catwoman. And even though we know it's the same person, Batman doesn't figure that out until the very end of the movie. So for all intents and purposes, it's just a separate character that they just made up for this movie, and I'm getting really sick of these original female characters showing up for one movie, being used as a plot device for Batman or Bruce Wayne, and then disappearing never to be seen again. And I think Miss Kitka is the first example of that trope. And I couldn't help but think of how much better it would have been if they hadn't done the Miss Kitka angle, if they had just used Catwoman to be the bait for Batman directly. Use Catwoman's feminine wiles to get under Batman's cape and get him romantically involved with the promise that she'll change her ways. Then they can ambush Batman, tie him up, and feed him to the exploding octopus. My gosh, this movie's silly. You know, there is something about this movie that while you watch it, you're just kind of taken in by the silliness and by the camp. It just kind of washes over you and you're like, okay, yeah, this all makes sense in the very heightened reality that is this movie. And then when you start saying some of this stuff out loud, like an exploding octopus or shark repellent bat spray or reducing world leaders to dust only to rehydrate them later, yeah, this movie's a trip. And speaking of world leaders, that's really what the third act of this movie centers around. They're going to use this dehydrating gun machine to zap World Security Council and the United Nations. I'm sorry, the United World Organization, not the United Nations, because this is not New York City, this is Gotham City, so they have to have a slightly different building that really functions the same way, because it's not New York City, it's Gotham City. Remember that. But they do exactly that. They infiltrate the United World Security Council, they zap everybody, they get them in separate vials, and they put them aboard their ship, and they're holding them for ransom. Each country has to pay to get their little dehydrated guy back. And as ridiculous as that sounds, it's just as ridiculous when you watch it. And even more so when the vials break inevitably in the fight, and Batman and Robin have to use a dust molecular separator to get all the different colors back in their own vials, hopefully so that when they rehydrate them, they'll be normal. They won't be like missing an arm or anything. I know this movie doesn't have that kind of budget, but I would love to see a version of this movie where they mess it up somehow. They didn't quite get the molecules right in the right vial, so like one guy's got the arm of a different guy and the other one's got a head of a different guy. It'd just be really funny. It would make no sense, and it would kind of break the internal logic of this world that everything just kind of works out. But there is kind of a funny joke like that in this movie. When Batman and Robin rehydrate them at the end, they're all speaking each other's languages, and I was like, okay, that's a fun little gag. It doesn't break the logic of the world too much. It's still in that campy, fun, having a happy ending way. Yeah, but clearly something didn't go quite right in the rehydration process. And because of that, Batman and Robin just escape out the window and climb down, and that's the end of the movie. It really just ends right there. That's pretty much Batman the movie. What can I say? This movie's a trip. It's a lot of fun. Sure, it does start to drag a little bit with the Miss Kicka subplot. Again, I wish they had played up the Batman Catwoman tension. Just keep them in costume. It's much more fun when they're in costume. It's much more ridiculous because some of the lines Batman and Robin and even the villains have to say when they're dressed in this completely ridiculous getup, that is just inherently funny. And as an adult watching it again, I had a lot of fun here. It's not the kind of thing you take 100% seriously, but for little kids, especially that are just starting to get into Batman and superheroes, this movie, along with the TV show that inspired it, are a really good introduction before you start getting into the heavier stuff, like DC's animated output, which it's really a weird thing when their animated stuff is more mature than their live action stuff, but that does seem to be the trend about half the time. Now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Batman the movie? Does it hold a special place in your heart as a Batman fan, or do you prefer the more grounded and serious takes on the Dark Knight? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.